I was 58 years old the morning my whole family turned against me. And the strange part, all I did was show up when nobody else would. If you've ever been the less successful one in your own family, if you've ever sat at a dinner table and felt like everyone was doing math in their head about how much less you were worth than they were, stay with me. Because what happened to me over the next few months is something I still think about every single day. And by the end of this story, I want you to tell me in the comments, would you have done what I did? My name is Michael Carter. I'm from a small town just outside Columbus, Ohio. For 32 years, I fixed furnaces and air conditioners for a living. I was an HVAC technician. Not glamorous, not impressive at family gatherings, just honest, hands-on work that paid the bills and put food on the table. My wife's name is Linda. We'd been married 30 years by the time all of this happened. 30 years of modest vacations, a paid-off house, 2 kids we raised right, and a marriage that I thought could survive anything. I loved Linda more than anything in this world. I still do. But love doesn't always protect you from the people closest to you. Sometimes it's the people closest to you who hurt you the most. Linda came from a bigger family than mine. Her parents, Harold and the late Margaret Bennett, had built a life out of hard, honest farm work in rural Ohio. But Linda's 2 brothers, Rick and Dennis, took a very different path than their father did. Rick owned a landscaping company that had grown into a small empire of contracts and crews. Dennis was a real estate agent, always in a blazer, always talking about market value and opportunity zones. Both of them drove nicer trucks than mine. Both of them had bigger houses. And both of them, for 30 years, treated me like the family embarrassment. "How's the furnace business, Mike?" Rick would say at Thanksgiving, smirking at his brother like it was the punchline of a joke they'd been telling since 1994. I let it roll off my back. Most of the time. A man learns to develop thick skin when he's the one everybody quietly looks down on, but there was one person in that family who never once made me feel small. One person who looked at me, really looked at me, and saw a man worth respecting. That man was my father-in-law, Harold Bennett. Harold was 82 years old, a lifelong farmer, quiet, weathered hands, the kind of man who said 10 words when everyone else said 100, but every one of those 10 words meant something. Harold never once asked me about my income. He asked me about my truck engine. He asked me if I'd caught anything on my last fishing trip. He treated me like a son, not a son-in-law, not the family charity case, a son. I want you to remember that detail, because it matters more than you know right now. Harold lived alone on the family farm since Margaret passed 6 years earlier. He still fed his cattle every morning at dawn, rain or shine, snow or summer heat. His kids kept telling him he should sell the land and move into assisted living. Harold kept telling them no. Then one cold February morning, everything changed. Harold was out in the field, feeding cattle, just like he did every single day of his life, when he collapsed. A neighbor found him 20 minutes later, barely conscious, one side of his face drooping. He'd suffered a stroke, a mild one, thank God, but still a stroke, at 82 years old, alone in a frozen field. He was rushed to Riverside Methodist Hospital in Columbus. The doctors stabilized him within hours. He was going to be okay, physically at least. But here's where the story really begins. Here's the moment that changed everything for me and for my entire family. When Harold was ready to be discharged, 3 days later, someone needed to pick him up from the hospital and drive him home. Simple enough, right? He had 3 grown children living within an hour of that hospital. Rick said he had a landscaping contract he couldn't reschedule. Dennis said he had a closing on a property that couldn't wait. And Linda, my own wife, said she had a hair appointment she'd booked months in advance and didn't want to lose the deposit. I remember standing in our kitchen when Linda told me this, completely unbothered, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Her 82-year-old father, who had just had a stroke, needed a ride home from the hospital, and not one of his 3 biological children could be bothered to go get him. I didn't say a word to Linda about what I thought of that. I just grabbed my truck keys. "I'll go get him," I said. Linda barely looked up. "You don't have to do that, Mike." But I already knew I did. I want you to sit with that for a second. Ask yourself, how many families out there have someone like me in them? The one who quietly does the right thing while everyone else is too busy, too important, too self-absorbed to notice an old man sitting alone in a hospital bed, waiting for someone, anyone, to come get him. I drove over 100 miles that morning, left before sunrise, coffee in one hand, heart heavy in my chest. Not because I minded the drive. I've never minded doing right by people. What weighed on me was knowing that Harold, a man who had given everything to his children, was sitting in that hospital bed, and none of his own kids cared enough to show up. When I walked into his hospital room, Harold was already dressed, sitting on the edge of the bed in his flannel shirt, staring out the window. He turned and looked at me, and for a second neither of us said anything. "They send you?" he asked. "I offered," I said. Harold nodded slowly. Something passed behind his eyes that I didn't fully understand yet. But I would, very soon I would. I helped him into my Ford F-150, got his discharge papers and medication bag, settled in the back seat, and started driving. I figured we were headed straight home to the farm. That's what made sense. That's what any reasonable person would expect. But as I turned onto the highway, Harold spoke up in a voice steadier than I expected from a man who'd just had a stroke 3 days earlier. "Don't take me home yet, Michael," he said. "Take me to Susan Miller's office, downtown. It's important." I glanced over at him. "Your lawyer?" "My lawyer," he confirmed. "And Michael, don't tell anyone we're going there. Not yet." Now I want you to imagine that moment. An 82-year-old man, 3 days removed from a stroke, asking you to secretly drive him to his attorney's office instead of home. What would you have done? Would you have questioned him, turned around, called your wife? I did none of those things. I just nodded and changed direction on the highway. Because here's something you need to understand about Harold Bennett. In 50-odd years on this earth, I had never once seen that man act rashly. Never seen him make an emotional decision. Everything he did with purpose, with thought, with years of quiet planning behind it. If Harold said it was important, it was important. We drove in silence for the first 10 minutes. Then Harold reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small digital voice recorder, the kind you'd buy at an electronics store, nothing fancy. "I need you to hear something," he said. "Before we get there." He pressed play. And what came out of that little recorder changed the course of my entire life. It was Rick's voice, clear as day, talking to someone. Later I'd learn it was a commercial land developer, about moving forward with the acquisition once the old man's out of the picture. Then Dennis's voice, agreeing, saying something about needing power of attorney locked down before he gets any better ideas. I felt my hands go cold on the steering wheel. "When did you record this?" I asked. 2 days ago, Harold said. "In my hospital room, they thought I was asleep. Pain medication makes an old man look pretty convincing when he wants it to." I didn't say anything for a long moment. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. Rick and Dennis, Linda's brothers, my own family, were sitting there, planning to sell their father's farm out from under him, while he was recovering from a stroke, while he was lying in a hospital bed that they hadn't even bothered to visit that day. "They've been planning this a long time, haven't they?" I said. It wasn't really a question. Harold looked out the window at the passing fields. 12 years, he said quietly. "I've been waiting 12 years for the right moment to do something about it. 12 years. Let that number sink in for a second. This wasn't a snap decision made from a hospital bed. This was something Harold had seen coming for over a decade and had been quietly preparing for the entire time. But what he'd say next would leave me even more stunned. What he'd tell me at that lawyer's office would put a target on my back that I never asked for and never saw coming. We pulled into the parking lot of a small brick office building downtown. A sign out front read, Miller and Associates, estate law. Harold looked at me before we got out of the truck. Michael, he said, I need you to know something before we walk in there. What happens today, it's going to change things. And not everyone in this family is going to understand it. Some of them are going to hate you for it. Hate me? I haven't done anything. I know, Harold said. That's exactly why. I didn't understand what he meant. Not then. I just followed him inside, still shaken from what I'd heard in that recording, still trying to process the fact that two men I'd shared holiday dinners with for 30 years were plotting to strip their own father of the land he'd spent his whole life building. Attorney Susan Miller was already waiting for us in her office. A woman in her 50s, sharp eyes, calm voice, the kind of person who looked like she'd seen every kind of family drama the state of Ohio had to offer. Harold, she said, standing to greet him, I'm glad you made it, and this must be Michael. She already knew my name. That should have told me something right there. This wasn't a spontaneous visit. Susan Miller had been expecting us. She walked to a locked filing cabinet in the corner of her office and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. The seal on it looked old, worn at the edges, like it had been sitting there for years, waiting. This has been ready for 7 years, Susan said, setting it down on the desk between us. Harold updates it every year to keep everything current, but the core of it hasn't changed since the day he first brought it to me. 7 years. My mind was still trying to catch up with the 12 years Harold had already mentioned in the truck. This wasn't some rushed decision made in a moment of anger after overhearing a hospital room conversation. This was a plan, a long, patient, carefully built plan. What is it? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Harold looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. Steady, certain, and underneath it, something that looked almost like relief, like a man finally setting down a weight he'd been carrying for over a decade. It's my legacy, Michael, he said, and it's about to become yours too, whether you're ready for it or not. Before I could ask what that meant, Harold said something else, something that hit me even harder than the recording had. Do you remember all those fishing invitations I sent you over the years? The ones you never showed up for? I frowned. Harold, I never got any fishing invitations from you, not one. I would have come every single time. Harold's jaw tightened. That's what I thought, he said. Linda's been intercepting my mail for years, Michael. Same with Rick and Dennis. They didn't want us getting close. They didn't want you finding out how much I trusted you. I sat there in that lawyer's office, absorbing information that felt like it was rewriting my entire understanding of my own marriage, my own family, the last 30 years of my life. My father-in-law had been trying to reach me. My own family had been quietly cutting me off from him. And I never even knew it was happening. By tonight, Harold said, looking me square in the eyes, everyone in this family is going to hate you. I need you to be ready for that. Because what I'm about to do, it's going to protect this family whether they thank me for it or not. And you're the only one I trust to help me do it. I didn't fully understand the weight of those words yet. I thought foolishly that I could handle whatever came next. I thought 30 years of being the quiet, dependable one in this family had prepared me for anything. I had no idea what was coming. We finished at Susan Miller's office a little after noon. Harold signed nothing that day. Susan explained that the real paperwork would come later, once certain things were confirmed and certain people were tested. But something had been set into motion, something none of us could take back. We drove out to the farm afterward, finally, 3 hours later than Harold's own children expected him home, and the second we pulled into that gravel driveway, I saw Rick's truck and Dennis's SUV already parked out front, waiting for us like a welcoming committee that wasn't there to welcome anyone. Rick was the first one out the door, storming across the porch before I'd even put the truck in park. "Where the hell have you two been?" he snapped, yanking open the passenger door before I could even get around the truck. "We've been calling for hours, Dad. Do you have any idea how worried we were?" I almost laughed. Worried. The same man who couldn't be bothered to drive to the hospital himself, now standing on the porch, acting like he'd spent the whole day pacing with concern. Harold, still buckled into the passenger seat, looked up at his son with a calm that unsettled even me. Worried, Harold repeated slowly. That's an interesting word for a man who didn't visit his father in the hospital for 3 straight days. Rick's face went through about 4 different expressions in 2 seconds. Anger, defensiveness, something close to guilt, quickly buried. I had a business to run, Dad. You know how it is. I know exactly how it is, Harold said, finally stepping down out of the truck with my hand steadying his elbow. I know a lot more than you think I do, Rick. Dennis had come down off the porch by now, too, arms crossed, eyes flicking suspiciously between his father and me. Where'd you two even go? The hospital said you were discharged at 10 this morning. It's after 12. I felt my stomach tighten. This was the moment. This was where I could either lie for Harold or tell a truth that would blow up in all our faces months before either of us was ready for it. Harold answered, before I had to. We stopped for lunch, he said simply. A man's allowed to eat a sandwich after a stroke, isn't he? It wasn't quite a lie. It also wasn't the truth. And I could tell by the way Rick's eyes narrowed at me that he didn't believe a word of it. Michael, Rick said, turning that same suspicious glare on me, you've been awfully quiet. I drove your father home, I said evenly. That's all I did today. But even as I said it, I knew something had shifted. Something in the air around that farmhouse had changed permanently, and none of us, not Harold, not Rick, not Dennis, and certainly not me, had any idea just how far this was about to go. That night, lying in bed next to Linda, I stared at the ceiling for hours. I thought about the recording, I thought about the 12 years, the 7 years, the sealed envelope sitting in Susan Miller's locked filing cabinet waiting for whatever Harold had planned next. I thought about the fishing invitations I never received. And somewhere around 2 in the morning, I heard the front door of our house creak open downstairs. I looked over. Linda's side of the bed was empty. I got up quietly and walked to the top of the stairs. Through the window, I could see her out in the driveway, in her robe. In the middle of the night, going through the glove compartment of my truck. I didn't say anything that night. I just watched her search through my truck for nearly 10 minutes before coming back inside, empty-handed and none the wiser that I'd seen everything. But I knew, standing there in the dark, at the top of my own staircase, that Harold had been right about one thing. Everyone in this family was about to hate me. And I hadn't even done anything yet. What happened over the next few weeks would test every single thing I thought I knew about my marriage, my family, and the man I thought I could trust more than anyone else in this world. Linda would stop looking me in the eye. Rick would hire someone to follow me. And a secret I didn't even know I was keeping would tear my 30-year marriage apart at the seams. But that's a story for next time. If you've made it this far, I want to know something from you. Have you ever been the quiet one in your family, the one everyone underestimates, right up until the moment it matters most? Tell me in the comments. Because trust me, this story is only just getting started. I never imagined that keeping one old man's secret would cost me my marriage, my income, and nearly my entire family. But that's exactly what happened. And the worst part, I still would have done it again. If you watched part 1, you already know how this started. My father-in-law, Harold Bennett, had a stroke. None of his own children bothered to pick him up from the hospital, and I was the only one who showed up. What I didn't know then was that showing up would turn me into the most hated man in my own family. Let me pick up right where I left off. The morning after I caught Linda searching through my truck at 2 in the morning, she acted like nothing had happened. She made coffee. She asked about my day. She didn't mention the driveway, the glove compartment, or the fact that she'd been out there in her robe for 10 minutes looking for something. I didn't bring it up either, not yet. I wanted to see how far this would go before I said anything. It didn't take long to find out. Within a week, Linda started asking me questions, small ones at first. What did you and Dad really talk about that day? Did you go somewhere before you brought him home? I gave her honest but incomplete answers. I told her we stopped for lunch, which was technically true. We did stop for lunch, just not before 3 hours at a lawyer's office. Linda wasn't stupid. She could tell I was holding something back. And in a marriage of 30 years, that kind of silence doesn't stay quiet for long. "Michael, I'm your wife," she said one night at the dinner table, her voice tight with frustration. "If something happened with my father, I have a right to know. Here's the thing about promises, though. Harold hadn't just asked me to keep a secret. He'd looked me in the eye and made me promise not for his sake, but for the sake of protecting something bigger than any of us understood yet. I had given my word to a man who had never once judged me, never once looked down on me, never once made me feel like the family disappointment. I wasn't about to break that promise, not even for Linda. I told you," I said, "we stopped for lunch, that's all." Linda's eyes searched my face for a long moment, and then something in her expression changed, hardened like a door closing. "You're lying to me," she said quietly. "I don't know why, but you're lying to me." I didn't answer, and my silence answered for me. That was the moment, I think, when everything started to unravel, because within days, the rumors began, and I have never in my life seen a small Ohio town chew someone up and spit them out the way mine did to me. It started small, a comment here, a whisper there, someone at the hardware store asking me, a little too casually, if it was true that I'd been taking advantage of Harold's condition. Someone at church looking at me sideways during the greeting time, like I'd suddenly become a stranger they didn't recognize. Rick and Dennis, it turned out, hadn't wasted any time. They'd been telling anyone who would listen that I'd manipulated their fragile, elderly father, that I'd taken advantage of a man recovering from a stroke to get him alone, isolate him from his real family, and convince him to do something he wouldn't have done in his right mind. The irony of it nearly took my breath away. The two men who couldn't be bothered to drive to a hospital were now painting themselves as the concerned, protective sons trying to save their father from a manipulative outsider. Me, the man who'd driven 100 miles before sunrise to make sure their father wasn't alone. But rumors don't care about irony. Rumors just need somewhere to spread. And in a small town, they spread fast. Within 2 weeks, I noticed something even more troubling. A dark sedan I didn't recognize, parked across the street from my house on more than one occasion. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. Then I saw the same car parked outside the hardware supply warehouse where I picked up parts twice a week. Then outside the diner where I met an old coworker for lunch, I finally confronted the driver directly one afternoon in the parking lot of that same diner. A man in his 40s, sunglasses, a camera with a long lens, sitting on the passenger seat in plain view. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, standing next to my truck. He didn't even try to deny it. "Rick Bennett hired me," he said flatly. "Private investigator, just doing my job, sir." I stood there in that parking lot, absorbing the fact that my own brother-in-law, a man I'd shared 30 Thanksgivings with, had hired someone to follow me, to photograph me, to build some kind of case against me for a crime I hadn't committed. That night, I called Susan Miller's office. I needed to understand what I was actually dealing with. Susan agreed to meet with me privately, and what she showed me made my blood roco. Development agreements. Signed contracts between Rick and a commercial land development firm, dated 3 months before Harold's stroke. 3 months. This wasn't a scheme born out of grief or opportunity after their father got sick. Rick had been negotiating to sell his father's farmland while Harold was still perfectly healthy, still out feeding cattle every single morning. He was planning this regardless of the stroke, Susan told me. The stroke just accelerated his timeline. I sat in my truck in that law office parking lot for a long time after that meeting, just staring at the steering wheel. I thought about Rick standing on that porch, demanding to know where his father and I had been. I thought about the fake concern in his voice. I thought about the private investigator with the camera sitting on his passenger seat. And I thought about the fact that I still couldn't tell anyone, not even my own wife, what I knew, because Harold had asked me to keep his secret, and I intended to, but keeping that secret was about to cost me more than I ever imagined. Word spreads fast in a small town, and it spreads even faster when someone with money and connections wants it to. Within a month, I started losing HVAC maintenance contracts I'd held for years. Regular customers, people I'd serviced for over a decade, suddenly telling me they'd decided to go a different direction. I later found out Dennis, through his real estate connections, had been quietly steering local business owners away from me, planting doubts about my character and my trustworthiness. Then the bank called. A credit hold had been placed on a small business line I used for parts and equipment. When I asked why, the loan officer mentioned, carefully and vaguely, that concerns had been raised about my financial conduct. Concerns raised by whom? I never got a straight answer. But I had a pretty good idea. I want you to imagine what that feels like. 32 years of honest work, 30 years of a spotless reputation in your own community, and within a month, it's all being quietly dismantled by people who share your last name at Thanksgiving. Ask yourself something right now, honestly. If your own family turned the whole town against you over something you didn't even do, would you have the strength to stay quiet? Because I'm not sure I did. Home wasn't any easier. Linda had grown colder every single day. She stopped asking me questions about Harold. She stopped asking me questions about anything, really. We started sleeping in the same bed like two strangers, sharing a room out of habit rather than love. The silence between us had a weight to it that I'd never felt in 30 years of marriage. One night, it finally broke into something louder. Linda came home from a visit with her mother's old friend, someone from church, clearly having heard some new version of the rumors circulating around town. "People are saying you took him somewhere that day," she said, standing in our kitchen, arms crossed tight across her chest. "That you took my father somewhere and got him to sign something? Is that true, Michael? Just tell me the truth." "Linda, just tell me," she said, her voice cracking. 30 years, Michael. 30 years, and I don't even recognize you right now." I stood there in my own kitchen, watching my wife of 30 years look at me like I was a stranger, and I had never in my life felt more alone. I wanted so badly to tell her everything, to explain the recording, the 7 years of preparation, the pre-probate agreements her own brother had signed behind their father's back, but I had made a promise. And more than that, I didn't fully trust, in that moment, what Linda would do with that information. Would she believe me, or would she run straight to Rick and Dennis with it? "I can't explain right now," I said quietly, "but I promise you, Linda, I never did anything to hurt your father. Everything I've done has been to protect him." She didn't believe me. I could see it in her eyes. And that night, for the first time in 30 years of marriage, I packed a bag and checked into a small motel off the highway just to give us both some space before things got said that couldn't be on side. I lived out of that motel room for almost 3 weeks. It was during that time, alone, isolated, watching my reputation and my marriage fall apart around me for a secret I hadn't even chosen to keep for my own benefit, that Harold called me light one night. His voice was weaker than it had been. The stroke recovery had been harder on him than he let on to anyone, but there was something in his tone that night that told me he needed to say something important. "Michael," he said, "I need to tell you something I've never told anyone. Not Margaret, not my own children. I'm listening, Harold. 12 years ago, Rick's landscaping business nearly went under. Bad contracts, bad debt, one bad season away from bankruptcy. Somebody paid off half of it anonymously, $90,000. Rick never found out who. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Harold, that wasn't you. There was a long pause on the phone. No, Michael, he said. It was you. I nearly dropped the phone. I opened my mouth to correct him, to tell him he had the wrong person, that I'd never had $90,000 to spare in my entire life, let alone give away anonymously. I checked the bank records years later, Harold continued, before I could say a word. Half your retirement savings, Michael. Gone in one transfer, the same month Rick's business turned around. You never told a soul. Not even Linda. My hands were shaking as I held that phone, because he was right. He was completely right. 12 years ago, I had quietly liquidated half of my retirement fund to save my brother-in-law's failing business, a man who had spent 30 years mocking my career, my income, my worth as a husband to his sister. I did it anonymously because I didn't want thanks. I did it because Linda loved her brother, and I loved Linda, and I couldn't stand the thought of watching her family fall apart when I had the means to stop it. I never told anyone, not Linda, not Rick, obviously. I let it disappear into the quiet part of my life where I kept things I didn't need credit for. But Harold had known. For 12 years, he had known exactly who I was, underneath all the jokes at the dinner table and the sideways looks at family gatherings. And it was that knowledge, that quiet 12-year-old knowledge of who Michael Carter really was, that had shaped everything that came after. That's why I trust you, Michael, Harold said, his voice growing tired. That's why it has to be you. A few nights later, Harold showed up unannounced at my motel room door, driven there by a neighbor who owed him a favor. He handed me a sealed envelope, thick and heavy in my hands. Don't open this, he said, unless you have to. You'll know when the time comes. I asked him what was in it. He wouldn't say. He just told me to trust him one more time. The way I had trusted him at the hospital, in the truck at Susan Miller's office. I trusted him. I always trusted him. 3 weeks later, on a cold December morning, Harold Bennett passed away peacefully in his sleep. A neighbor found him with his late wife's photograph on the nightstand beside him and his worn leather Bible open on his chest. The doctor said his heart simply gave out, not unusual for a man his age who'd survived a stroke months earlier, but no less devastating for the family he left behind. I drove out to the farm the moment I heard. I stood in that quiet farmhouse, surrounded by the smell of coffee that would never be made again, and I grieved for a man who had trusted me more than my own family ever had. The funeral was 3 days later. And if you think grief might have finally united this broken family, even for a moment, I promise you it didn't. I watched Rick and Dennis stand off to the side of the funeral home during the visitation, not comforting their grieving sister, not greeting the neighbors and friends who'd come to pay respects to a man they clearly loved, but talking in hushed voices about property lines and market values and how quickly a farm sale could close. At their own father's funeral, I stood there in that room, watching two grown men calculate the value of their father's land while his casket sat less than 30 feet away, and I understood, finally and completely, exactly why Harold had trusted me instead of them. But grief, it turns out, wasn't the end of this story. It was only the beginning of the real fight. 2 weeks after the funeral, I was served with legal papers at my own front door. Rick had filed a petition in probate court. He was formally challenging his father's estate plan, claiming Harold Bennett had lacked the mental capacity to make sound legal decisions in the final months of his life. And right there, in black and white, printed in a courtroom filing meant to become public record for the entire town to read my own name. The petition accused me directly of undue influence over a vulnerable elderly man. It called me manipulative, predatory. It suggested I had exploited a stroke victim for personal financial gain. I stood on my own front porch holding those papers in my hands, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I felt real fear. Not fear of losing money, not even fear of losing my reputation, which was already in shreds around town. I was afraid I was about to lose everything: my marriage, my freedom, my name, over a promise I'd made to a man who could no longer stand beside me to defend it. Linda still hadn't come home. My business was in ruins. My name was being dragged through a public courtroom filing for the entire county to read. And the only thing standing between me and complete destruction was a sealed envelope I still hadn't opened, sitting in a drawer in a motel room, waiting for the moment Harold told me I would know. That moment was coming faster than I expected, because in less than 2 weeks, I would be standing in a courtroom, watching a judge decide whether I was a devoted son-in-law who had simply shown up when it mattered most, or a manipulative predator who deserved to lose everything. And what happened in that courtroom would change my family forever. I need to know something from you before we go any further. Have you ever done something quietly good for someone, something you never expected credit for, only to have it twisted into something ugly by people who never showed up themselves? Tell me in the comments. Because trust me, what happens in that courtroom is something none of us saw coming, not even me. I sat in a courtroom accused by my own family of manipulating a dying old man, and the strange thing was, the only person in that room who could clear my name had already passed away, or so I thought. If you've been with me for part 1 and part 2, you already know everything that led to this moment. My father-in-law, Harold Bennett, trusted me over his own children. I kept his secret, and it cost me my marriage, my business, and nearly my entire reputation. Now let me tell you what happened when I finally walked into that courtroom. The Fairfield County probate courtroom wasn't anything like what you see on television. No dramatic gavel banging, no shouting attorneys, just a quiet fluorescent lit room filled with folding chairs, and every single one of them that first morning was filled with someone I recognized: neighbors, church members, people from town who'd heard every version of the rumors that had been spreading about me for months. I sat next to Susan Miller at the front table, my hands folded tightly in my lap, trying not to look at Rick and Dennis sitting across the aisle with their own attorney. Linda sat several rows back, alone, not with her brothers, not with me, just alone, in the middle of a courtroom, watching her own family tear itself apart in public. Rick's petition claimed that Harold Bennett had lacked the mental capacity to make sound legal decisions in the months following his stroke, and that I had exercised undue influence over him during that vulnerable period. If the judge agreed, everything Harold had carefully built over 7 years of planning could be thrown out entirely. The first witness Susan called was Dr. Patricia Yang, the neurologist who had treated Harold both during his hospital stay and in the months afterward. She testified calmly and clinically that Harold's cognitive function following his stroke had remained fully intact. His speech, his memory, his decision-making capacity, all of it tested repeatedly, all of it within completely normal range for a man his age. In my professional opinion, Dr. Yang said, looking directly at the judge, Harold Bennett was of entirely sound mind right up until the day he passed. I watched Rick's jaw tighten from across the courtroom. That was strike 1 against his entire case. Then Susan played the recording. I hadn't heard it since that morning in my truck months earlier, but hearing it again in that courtroom with a judge and a room full of people listening, it hit differently. Rick's voice, clear and unmistakable, talking to a developer about moving forward once the old man's out of the picture. Dennis's voice agreeing, discussing the need to lock down power of attorney before their father could interfere. The courtroom went dead silent. I watched several people in the gallery turn and stare at Rick and Dennis with expressions I can only describe as disgust. I watched Linda, sitting alone in her row, put a hand over her mouth. Susan followed the recording with documents, the same pre-probate development agreement she'd shown me months earlier in her office. Signed contracts, dated 3 months before Harold's stroke, proof that this wasn't some desperate scheme born out of a medical emergency. This had been planned, calculated, and set into motion while Harold was still perfectly healthy. Then Susan called her final witness, someone I hadn't even known was involved until that morning, Gary Holbrook, Rick's former accountant, a man who had worked for Rick's landscaping business for nearly a decade. Before a falling out 2 years earlier, Gary testified that he had personally processed escrow deposits from a commercial land development firm, payments made directly to Rick in the weeks leading up to Harold's death. Payments for land Rick didn't legally own, land that belonged entirely to his father. I watched the judge's expression shift as Gary spoke. I watched her write something down, slow and deliberate, the kind of note that told me this case had just fundamentally changed direction. Then it was my turn. Susan called me to the stand, and as I walked past Rick and Dennis's table, I felt the eyes of the entire courtroom on me. This was the moment. Months of rumors, months of financial ruin, months of a shattered marriage, all leading to this single moment where I finally got to speak. Susan asked me simple, direct questions. Why did I drive Harold to the lawyer's office instead of home? What Harold had told me that day. Why I had kept his secret, even when it cost me my marriage and my business. He asked me to trust him, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. He'd never once given me a reason not to, not in 30 years. Then Susan asked me to read something aloud. A letter, Harold's final letter, the one he'd handed me in a sealed envelope outside my motel room weeks before he passed away, the one he'd told me I would know when the time came to open. That time had come 3 days earlier, when Susan called and told me the trial was starting. I'd opened that envelope alone, sitting on the edge of a motel bed, and read words that broke me down in a way nothing else in this entire ordeal had managed to. Now I stood in front of a courtroom full of strangers and read Harold Bennett's final words aloud, my voice cracking more than once. Michael, the letter began, if you're reading this, then it's finally time. And I imagine things have gotten harder for you than I ever wanted them to. I'm sorry for that. I never wanted my choices to cost you your peace. But I need you to understand something. In 82 years, I've known a lot of men with more money than sense, men who talk about family and mean nothing by it. And then there's you, a man who never once asked me for anything, a man who showed up to a hospital at 5 in the morning without being asked, who kept a secret that cost him everything, who quietly saved my son's business 12 years ago and never told a soul. You didn't marry into this family for what you could get out of it, Michael. You married my daughter because you loved her, and you stayed a good man through 30 years of people who never appreciated what you were worth. I saw it. Even when nobody else did, I saw it. That farm isn't going to developers. That farm isn't a payday for anyone. It's the only thing I have left of Margaret, of my own father, of the life I built with my own 2 hands. I need someone to protect it, not to own it, not to profit from it, but to protect it. For this family, for this community, for the generations that come after all of us are gone. I trust you to do that, Michael. I always have. Thank you for always showing up. I don't remember much about the courtroom in the minutes after I finished reading that letter. I remember the silence. I remember hearing someone crying softly behind me, and when I finally looked up, I saw Linda standing. She hadn't been called to testify. Nobody had asked her to speak. But she stood up on her own in the middle of that courtroom and asked the judge for permission to say something. "I owe my husband an apology," Linda said, her voice shaking but clear enough for the entire room to hear. "In front of everyone, because I doubted him. I searched his truck in the middle of the night. I let my brothers convince me that the man I've been married to for 30 years, the man who has never once given me a reason not to trust him, had suddenly become someone capable of manipulating a dying old man for money." She turned finally to look directly at Rick and Dennis. "You two didn't even visit your own father in the hospital," she said, her voice breaking. "You didn't show up when he needed you, and now you're standing here calling Michael a manipulator when the only thing he ever manipulated was his own schedule to make sure Dad wasn't alone." The courtroom was completely silent. I looked at my wife standing there, finally saying out loud everything I had wanted her to understand for months, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I felt something loosen in my chest. The judge called a short recess after that. When court resumed 40 minutes later, she didn't take long to deliver her ruling. She found, based on the medical testimony, the recorded evidence, the financial documents, and the accountant's testimony, that Harold Bennett had been of completely sound mind when he updated his estate plan. She found clear and convincing evidence that Rick Bennett had engaged in premature, unauthorized negotiations to sell property that legally belonged to his father, and that this fact directly undermined the credibility of his claims against me. The petition to challenge Harold's trust was denied in full. I sat there hearing those words, feeling months of accumulated weight lift off my shoulders all at once. But what came next surprised me more than anything else that entire day, because Harold hadn't left the farm directly to me, the way Rick and Dennis had feared, the way half the town had assumed I'd been scheming for all along. There was no windfall, no personal fortune handed to the son-in-law everyone had spent 30 years underestimating. Instead, Harold had named me successor trustee of the Bennett Family Land Trust, a legal structure he'd spent 7 years quietly building with Susan Miller's help. The farm couldn't be sold, not by me, not by Rick, not by Dennis, not by anyone, for at least 3 generations, unless every single living descendant agreed unanimously. My job as trustee wasn't to profit from that land, it was to protect it, to manage it responsibly, to make sure it stayed exactly what Harold had always intended it to be, a working, breathing piece of this family's legacy, not a commercial development deal. I wasn't given a fortune that day, I was given a responsibility. And somehow, that felt like exactly the right ending to this story. In the weeks that followed, the fallout for Rick and Dennis was significant. Word travels fast in a small town, and word of a courtroom recording exposing 2 grown men plotting to sell their sick father's farm out from under him travels even faster. Rick lost several major landscaping contracts within a month. Longtime clients quietly moved their business elsewhere, unwilling to work with a man whose own courtroom testimony had painted such an ugly picture of who he really was. Dennis's real estate brokerage distanced itself from him almost immediately, citing concerns about professional conduct, though everyone in town knew exactly what that really meant. I won't pretend I felt sorry for them. I'd spent 30 years being looked down on by both of those men. I'd spent months as their scapegoat, their convenient villain, while they quietly plotted to profit off their own father's misfortune. Whatever consequences came their way, they'd earned every bit of it themselves. As for the farm, I leased the working fields to Ben Walker, a neighbor Harold had trusted and worked alongside for over 20 years, keeping the land active and productive exactly the way Harold would have wanted. That first autumn after the trial, I organized something Harold never got the chance to see, a community harvest festival, right there on the family land, open to neighbors, church friends, and anyone in town who wanted to come. Remember a good man who'd spent his whole life quietly taking care of the people and the land around him. It wasn't about restoring my reputation, though, I won't lie to you. It did help with that too. It was about giving that farm back its purpose, about making sure Harold's legacy wasn't a courtroom battle and a family scandal, but a place where people still gathered, still laughed, still remembered what mattered. Linda and I are still rebuilding. Even now, 30 years of marriage doesn't repair itself overnight, and I won't pretend the last several months didn't leave real scars between us. We started counseling together about 2 months after the trial ended. It's been slow, honest, sometimes painful work, but for the first time in a long while, there are no more secrets sitting between us. I told her everything, the recording, the 7 years of planning, the $90,000 I gave her brother 12 years ago that I never told a single soul about. She cried for a long time after that last part. I think it finally helped her understand who I really was, underneath 30 years of quiet, unappreciated devotion. We're not the same couple we were before Harold's stroke. In some ways, I think we're stronger. In other ways, there's a wariness that will probably take years to fully heal. But we show up for each other now every single day, the same way I showed up for her father when nobody else would. I think about Harold almost every day. I think about that morning in the hospital, the recording in the truck, the sealed envelope, the 12 years. He quietly watched me from a distance, waiting to see if I was really the man he believed me to be. I never set out to be anyone's hero. I never wanted a courtroom battle, a broken marriage, or a town full of rumors about a scheming I never committed. All I ever did was drive 100 miles before sunrise to pick up an old man who needed a ride home. But sometimes, showing up when nobody else will is the only thing that matters. Sometimes the quiet, unglamorous choice to simply do the right thing is the thing that changes everything, for better and for worse, and eventually for better again. I still visit that farm every week. I still feed the small handful of cattle Ben and I kept, just like Harold did every single morning for 60 years. And every time I stand out in that field at sunrise, I think about a quiet old man who saw something in me that nobody else in my own family ever bothered to look for. So let me ask you the same question I've been asking myself for months now. If you were the quiet one in your family, the one everyone underestimates, the one nobody expects much from, would you have shown up the way I did? Would you have kept the secret? Would you have paid the price I paid for a man who believed in you more than your own family ever did? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story meant something to you, if it made you think differently about the quiet, unglamorous people doing the right thing in your own life, do me a favor and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. It meant more to me than you know.